Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Joining me tonight as co-host is Ben Kinsley. Ben, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's cool. And our special guest tonight is my very own representative, Representative Anne Donahue from Northfield. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Nice to, I haven't seen you in a while.
I know, it's good to be here.
COVID.
At my age, it's just good to be seen. That's what we say. So I'm sure folks know who you are, but just in case, could you give us a little background of your life by Anne Donahue?
My life,
My
wow.
life.
Well, I'm from Northfield, and I moved there in 1990, but I've got like 5 generations of roots in Northfield.
Right.
So one of the Irish families that came over at the time of the Great Hunger and worked on the railroad. And
Nice.
so I've got lots of, second cousins and third cousins and so forth in Northfield. But I grew up different places around there. I was born in Vermont. I was dragged out of here kicking and screaming. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it because I figure most babies at age 6 months are kicking and screaming.
Well, that's
So
true.
There you go.
Little did they know you had a method to your madness.
Ended up really a lot in journalism, which was my father's business. Ended up going to Georgetown Law School. Came out of that and actually ended up doing work in juvenile law. Working with runaway and homeless kids in New York City and then Los Angeles. And came back to Vermont and actually became very ill. Got a very serious mental illness. Was in and out of the hospital for 4 or 5 years. Got involved with the Vermont Psychiatric Survivor newspaper, Counterpoint. And I was doing advocacy, mental health advocacy in the State House.
Right.
And some folks, gosh, somebody you probably know from Barrie, a certain Representative Tom Koch, who was on the healthcare committee at the time.
Right.
And he started working at me saying, I think you should run for the legislature. And so that's how I got sucked into it.
Yeah, Tom would have that appeal to people. He's pretty persistent.
You feel like, hey, you're smart. You should be in.
Every
You should
once
be
in
here.
a while, he still writes his scribblings, which I love when he does that.
Yes.
He does that. So,
Old timer.
Yeah, good.
So you mentioned Counterpoint, which is an organization of psychiatric survivors here in Vermont. I believe it was started in Rutland in 1998. Is that accurate?
Well, Counterpoint, the newspaper, actually started in before that, but in 1998 is when Vermont Psychiatric Survivors took on the contract for publishing Counterpoint.
Cool.
Got
So
it.
it's actually, it's up around 35 years old now.
Wow.
Been around for a little while.
Been around for quite a while. But it comes out 3 or 4 times a year and really reports on issues of interest specifically to psychiatric survivors, but the broader community who want to follow what's happening in mental health issues in the state.
And what are some of the trends that you've seen over the last 30 years or so that you've been involved in mental health in Vermont? Like, much has changed nationally.
Right.
Obviously, things have changed here in the state as well, closing the state hospital. And what sort of evolutions have you seen over that time period?
It's interesting because I think in a lot of ways there's been evolution that's been progress towards people, maybe less stigma for mental health issues, more efforts certainly in the past 50 or 60 years getting people out of the hospital and in the community, people who may have very long-term illness but can do very well with support in the community. But also there is sort of a never-ending tension around being able to provide people enough support in the community so that they can do well and not end up instead being back in hospitals. And we've seen that ongoing tension building new higher ends of care that maybe wouldn't have needed to be done if we had supported the community more. We've got a lot of ongoing vacancies. Of course, workforce is a problem everywhere, but it has been really chronic in the community mental health system because wages are low. And so if you constantly, don't have enough staff to provide the supports, people don't do as well, and we end up having to pay more, and it's a lot worse for the folks involved as well.
Yeah.
Did COVID have a lot to do with the increases in mental health issues?
I think COVID made a difficult situation worse. It seems to have affected kids in particular.
Right.
Schools
Because
are really saying that now.
one of the biggest precipitators for having mental health struggles and crises is isolation, social
Right.
isolation.
Oh, so let's stay home for 2 years.
Right, it's connection. It's connection
Right.
with people that
Right.
keep people well. It keeps all of us mentally healthy and well to
Yeah.
be connected to our community. So isolation is a real contributor, and
Right.
I think we really saw the effects of that.
So Ben, you said I just wanted to follow up, you said they're figuring that out now in schools?
Well, in the schools, they're really seeing that, both social anxiety among kids, depression. They're not coming to school in a healthy mindset,
Ready to learn. Wasn't that
ready to
the,
learn.
right.
And
That's combined. I think that we want to attribute everything to COVID these days, but that's part of something we were already seeing because of the opioid epidemic
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
pre-COVID, and of course that's only gotten worse as well. But the schools were beginning to see the impact of the opioid epidemic
Yeah.
as the children in that generation were coming to school and making their way
Right.
up in the grades.
And that's something we haven't heard much of at all, and I know it hasn't gotten any better, opioid addiction.
well, it's gotten worse,
Yeah,
and,
gotten worse.
And they
we
haven't
kind of
talked
swept
about
it
it.
under the rug because of all the other issues.
Yeah, and Anne's right, it's all about COVID.
Yeah.
If there's a problem, it's from COVID, but actually,
I mean, COVID in a lot of ways just shone a light on things that were already happening, right? I mean, there is this separation piece that exacerbated
Right.
a number of things. It made just teaching very difficult, right?
Yeah.
When you have like some kids that are in the classroom, some kids that are not in the classroom. You have 5 students out on any given day because they have cold symptoms. That's a very fragmented education experience.
And then on top of that, you have the impact that COVID had on, what the great retirement, whatever.
Yeah, the great retirement. Yeah.
All the folks who just said,
I'm done.
I'm ready to,
Right.
and so we have this across the board workforce shortage, and you go to any, you go to industry, you go to teaching, you go to mental health, you go nursing, everywhere
Right.
you go, we have this crisis in workforce. And so that contributes. If you're struggling with your mental health and you're on a long waiting list to
Right.
get support, obviously that's also going to
Right.
make things worse.
Well, and I think 2 things in particular happened during COVID that have impacted the workforce issue. It's the wave of retirements, and then another piece that happened is those retirees typically in non-COVID times would have gone south, like Carolinas, Virginia, Florida, something,
yeah.
and they didn't. They stayed.
Interesting.
I didn't think of that.
So if you look at the out-migration, particularly out-migration of 55 plus,
Yeah.
dropped off a cliff during COVID.
That's intriguing.
So they retired, but then stayed. So that housing stock was not coming open for new
Right.
people coming in, and then all of the COVID refugees.
Right, buying up,
Yeah,
Buying up properties.
So in terms of
Sight
the housing
unseen.
crisis.
So the housing that was already there,
Yeah,
that was already there, got bought up by these COVID refugees, and then the housing that would have normally become available
Right.
as people moved out of the workforce didn't become available. And so now you have this housing crisis of you have a smaller workforce, you have nowhere to put them because there's no housing stock
right, you can't attract
Right.
people to jobs if
Yeah,
they
'cause
can't
no
find a
place to
if
place
they
live.
to
can't
live.
find a place to live. And so it's a very interesting situation that there's no easy way out of except to build more houses, which
Which
is what we're
takes
doing.
time.
Which
So
takes
that's not
time.
a
Yeah.
quick,
And it's expensive. Like you can't build a house really for under $500,000 right now. Like it's just not feasible. So
You bought a house for a little under,
I bought a house for $35,000.
is that
Yeah.
right in
5 years
Northfield?
ago, yeah.
yeah,
I bet that you get a lot
Needed a
more.
little
for-
fix-up.
a little fix
Yeah,
up, a little bit of
fixer-upper.
fix up.
And she was good at it.
Yeah. Well, that's gonna be a fun project if you know what you're doing.
Well, and
Yeah,
that's,
she
to
does.
me, it was fun. It was,
Yeah.
I spent several years on it, and
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
it's
Animals and all. right?
Animals.
Well, I was over there one day.
Animals that were not supposed to be inside.
But I handled it.
You handled it.
I didn't panic, which I thought, was like, "Ching, what is that?"
Oh boy.
But it was coming from the outside in. Anyway, let's get back to the legislature. You had been an advocate for mental health and on that committee for many, many years. And the leadership this year saw fit to move you. Fortunately, they at least moved you to the healthcare.
Human services.
Human services, yeah. And now you told me that was healthcare before? That's where you were before?
So it has
the mental health and separate.
Well, right. So when I first came to the legislature 20 years ago
Right.
now, we had a committee just like the Senate called Health and Welfare.
Right.
The year after I had gotten the next session, those were broken into two in order to give one committee a really sharp focus on healthcare and healthcare reform.
Okay.
And all the other human services stayed in human services. I stayed on human services initially because mental health was kept as part of human services. Right. The legislature finally caught on that what we were saying was state public policy ought to be our own policy as well, and that mental health was part of health care.
Right.
And so mental health jurisdiction was moved to the health care committee, and I moved with it. That was when I moved to the health care committee. Health care work has been what brought me to the legislature, along with mental health, but really health care reform. And so then I was on the health care committee from that time on, and eventually became vice chair of the committee. But yeah, last year we passed the constitutional amendment out of the House and Senate,
Right.
and it went to the people. And I had some strong feelings that, regardless of my own personal feelings about it,
Right.
that it wasn't right for Vermont if Vermonters knew what it actually did and said, that it covered, abortion up to the time of birth,
Right.
and that it was really crucial for people to have that knowledge, to be educated, to hear, because most people don't support completely unrestricted
Right.
abortion. So I ended up becoming a spokesperson for Vermonters for Good Government, which
Right.
was an organization that formed specifically
Right.
to educate people. And of course, that was not a popular position with the majority and the leadership.
Right.
And, our House Speaker was a former policy director for Planned Parenthood. Right. This was a major priority. So I came back, and surprise, I was demoted.
Right.
I was removed from the Health Care Committee and put back on Human Services
Right.
in a lower position. And she insisted it had nothing to do with that, but she didn't really have a rationale.
No, I don't.
otherwise.
I would love to hear that explanation.
Yeah.
And Ann and I must say, I wrote an op-ed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you did. That's
It's
right.
pretty much you and I were on the same wavelength, but at least there's healthcare and stuff in the human services. There's a lot of related issues. So
There are.
They haven't put you in some fish and wildlife or something.
That's right. Yeah.
That would have been wild.
That would have been right. Exactly. Wake them up. But I do. If I could ask, speaking of speaking out on things, you were quoted speaking of abortion. There's the abortion shield law.
Yeah.
And you were vocal on that on the floor just yesterday or the day before.
I guess it was Friday.
Yeah.
Well, the shield law really, I don't think the underlying bill is a highly controversial one. In effect, what it says is we respect our own laws in Vermont, and I respect the decision of the people.
Right.
I'm not off introducing bills saying let's reduce rights. I mean, this is what people chose. But what its focuses on is, and if other people come to our state and their state laws are different, we're not going to let their states chase them into Vermont. So that's why it's called a shield law. It's to protect our providers from other state actions where things are much more restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
My feeling was, I have introduced a bill many times over the last several biennia. Vermont is one of only 2 states that has no conscience protection law for providers. In other words, if you don't want to be involved in certain practices because they violate your moral or ethics, there will not be retribution against you. You can't lose your job because you won't be involved. You're a nurse. You don't want to. You say,
and
I
we
don't
had
want
a
to assist
nurse
in
last year to lose her job at UVM.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so it's an issue in Vermont. We have not addressed it, and I really felt, you know, when the body won't take up an issue, the body in a broad sense, really you end up the only mechanism is to try to bring it to the floor through a related bill. So I brought an amendment to the SHIELD law saying we're shielding doctors, we're shielding providers who want to provide a service to people who may be coming from out of state. We should shield those who don't want to be providing that service. It was ruled as not being germane to the underlying bill, so there wasn't even an ability to have a vote on it. So I voted against the underlying bill because of the lack of willingness to take up the conscience law, not because the underlying bill was, you know, deeply problematic. I think there was a real logic to it, to saying, you know, because of all of the stir around other states. I don't think that it really was addressing a real threat in Vermont, but it certainly has a chilling effect on a provider. Just like it can have a chilling effect on providers if they have an ethical issue with providing a service. So I thought there was a real tie between those issues.
Do doctors have to do what you ask them to do? No. If they don't want to do a surgery, they can refer you to somebody else now, right?
Well, that's right. But if you're employed by a hospital...
And they tell you, right?
Yeah, and you're on a rotation. And I think it affects more, you know, nursing staff and people like that who, you know... So.
Yeah, because they have to do basically what the doctor tells them to do. Yeah, or it's insubordination.
Just one more question, then I'll you said that you respect what the voters did, and it was pretty overwhelming to support. Do you think that they all understood what that bill, or they just heard the women's right argument?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of factors. I don't think people understood in any depth. I think there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of advertising that was you know, a doctor talking about if my patient is having a medical crisis, I need to be able to do what she needs. Well, nobody was saying, you know, and that's been clear under Vermont law. So I think there was misinformation. I think there was a lot of given the amount of national debate and states that are retracting rights, I think it was just a fear, not based on a lot of knowledge.
And then you had Roe versus Wade.
This was like the one thing that you could, and even if you didn't necessarily 100% agree with, you know, the language of the amendment, this is like one thing you could do to try to take power back.
I think that's really well said. It's like we want to protect this right in Vermont. So, you know, maybe it's not perfect, and maybe it's kind of vague, and maybe it goes further than I would want, but we have to protect it in Vermont. So I think that.
Well, the irony of that too is, like, you know, I'm not disparaging the effort to do it, but it really is no effect. Because the state policy up until this point, state law already said you can do all these things.
It didn't say anything.
It doesn't change state law.
It doesn't change anything. What it does do is, you know, prevent future changes, which is what people wanted. We want to prevent future change. If you think it through, though, there might be some things that we would want to pass a law to protect Vermonters, and we wouldn't be able to do that.
And we wouldn't be able to do that.
We kind of tie our own hands, and people were saying, yeah, well, we want to tie our own hands against ever taking away rights, but it could also mean tying our hands on things that we think do need to happen in the future. But for right now, it makes
all the bill did is it prevents, or all the amendment did is it prevents the Vermont legislature from ever doing something in the future.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And I don't think that that's what people are afraid of. People aren't afraid of the Vermont legislature doing something.
Oh, they're Washington.
They're afraid of Washington
That's
doing
right.
something.
And the Vermont Constitution.
And the Vermont Constitution
Right.
does not do anything to protect you from Washington.
Exactly.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
sorry. But I think that's what this is the one thing that people could do that felt empowering, and I think that's why Vermonters got behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
So let's talk about some of her bills here that we.
Yeah, there's a bunch of bills that you've introduced really over the past couple decades, but also in the past couple years. There's some interesting ones that we should talk about. Three primarily, I think, this year. And I don't know which one in order you want to talk about them, but I think the one of the ones that's interesting to me is the right to repair bill. That's a big national conversation. That's a bill that you introduced this year. Maybe talk to us
Yeah.
about that one.
Yeah, and it's not an issue that I was conscious of, or it wasn't on my radar. You know, I'm very focused on healthcare issues and mental health issues. This was a high school student in Berlin who contacted me and said, you know, I don't know if you can do anything about it, but it's so frustrating. This is a young entrepreneur, exactly the kind of young person we want to see in Vermont, you know, who's got a knack for fixing electronic equipment, was doing it for neighbors and so forth, making a little money on the side, and running more and more and more into the inability to do it because manufacturers put barriers into people being able to repair their own equipment so that they control it, and you have to bring it back to them.
Right.
Now, electronics is only one example. It's across the board. We discovered this huge problem for our agriculture community with agricultural equipment.
John Deere had a whole class action lawsuit about it.
That's right. So
Really?
it's become a big issue in a number of different areas. And so this young man is the one who brought it to my attention, and I said, well, I think you're right. I mean, this is a real issue.
Yeah.
And I brought it to Legislative Council and discovered there was another legislator working on it. So I joined forces with her. And she was aware that there was a national right to repair group who helped give us guidance on how to craft the bill. And we actually did two. One that's a broad one. And then in order to sort of maybe you have to bite one piece off at a time. So one of them is specifically for agricultural equipment. So there are two bills that we put in.
Oh,
This is-
how do you think it's going to, is there support for the idea? It makes sense to me.
There's definitely support for the idea. It's a very complicated thing because, first of all, there's an extremely powerful lobbying effort. The minute we put those bills in, you know that somebody nationally is being paid to watch every single legislature because we got flooded with emails from these national companies. Saying, you know,
Stop,
the
desist.
world is going to fall apart if you pass this.
Yeah.
So
you're going to avoid warranties. Like this is one of the tools that they use,
it's going
right?
to harm
As soon as a
people.
non-certified retailer touches it, your warranty's void.
Well, and they were saying, you know, people will overturn the pollution devices. You're gonna make pollution worse. People are gonna get injured. You're not, you know,
Heartstring stuff.
So, so it's very controversial. I think it's one of those issues that the more legislators take up bills, work on the issue. You remember the GMO
Oh, yes.
bills
Yeah, how
when
could
you
you
were in the
forget?
legislature.
Yeah, right.
So Vermont stuck its neck out and actually passed a GMO labeling
Right.
law. Other states were doing it as well, and all of a sudden, everybody came together and said, we don't want these scattered laws, and asked the federal government to enact a
one.
law so that there'd be a uniform
Right.
regulation for GMO labeling. And I think we'll see, that's what we're seeing
great.
with John Deere and so forth. We're going to see more of that, is putting the pressure on.
Good.
So, you know, even if this bill doesn't pass this year, one of these, it's going to help. I think there will probably be at least hearings on it. We'll start taking it up again. It's been looked at by our Commerce Committee in the past as an issue, so we'll just
Well,
keep
you're
that
starting the
pressure on.
conversation. That's a good
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, that's been a conversation in agriculture in particular for decades now, as farm equipment's getting more sophisticated.
That's exactly
and,
it.
You know, and you know, seeing the ability to repair vehicles in like the automotive sector is a good comparison, right? There are things that have happened there as well, where like sometimes you need specialized tools or software or whatever to diagnose vehicles, but historically you've been able to take it, fix it yourself, take it to any mechanic you want.
Yep.
And that really hasn't been true for farm equipment, and that disparity is
You've
what
got to go to the dealer.
You got to go to
they
the
have
dealer.
Totally control. Yeah.
Yeah, and that disparity is really what farmers have been pointing to for decades now, and have mostly been on the losing end of that argument.
Well, and that's why we separated out and said, we need to prioritize this
Nice.
one as the first bite to take, even if we can't get the whole piece.
Exactly.
Go ahead. I'm surprised you picked that one out of the three.
Well, so
I thought you'd go for the hard cider one.
well, we can talk about that next.
We usually do beer here.
Yeah, beer.
Oh, yeah.
Farming
great
is
field to talk about.
agriculture is close to my heart. My family had a farm when I was growing up. I used to spend summers
okay.
working there, and this was a
Nice.
problem that they had. They purposely bought older tractors because
they could fix
because
it.
they could fix them,
Yeah.
and they did all the work themselves.
Yeah.
And so the minute you did that, the warranty was gone, and that was it?
Well, I mean, they
These
were.
are ones where the warranty were already expired.
Yeah, this
Oh,
is
they-
like
oh,
they were
oh,
buying
oh,
tractors from like
right.
the 70s,
Right.
that didn't have computers in them.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So
Well, good for this
Now,
kid.
I'm a big, as you know, I'm
Yes.
a big
Fixer-upper.
fix-it-yourself
He's
person. I did
very
my whole
talented.
house, so I had a lot of sympathy for him. And I have a younger brother who, when he was a kid, when we were kids, he would go to the town dump and pull out like the thrown out lawnmowers and take them
fix 'em.
home and fix them
Yep.
and sell them.
Nice.
Yeah.
So,
Good.
at any rate.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah.
that's what reduce, reuse, recycle, right?
got it.
And go take something from the landfill, fix it, and put it back on the street.
That's great. That's good.
So, hard cider.
Hard cider.
hard
cider.
So let me just ask both of you for a minute. If I say, in this hand I got a glass of cider, and in this hand I got a glass of hard cider, what are you going to tell me is different about them?
One of them has alcohol in it.
Which one?
The hard cider.
Oh, the hard cider has alcohol, and the cider you assume doesn't?
Yes.
I bet we're wrong.
Well, we passed a bill on the very last day of the session last year when, 20 bills are going
Right.
through, back and forth between the House and Senate, and everything's flying around. And I'm looking at this one bill that was mostly all sorts of technical changes to our beverages
Right.
laws and so forth. And I'm looking, and there's a definition, and the definition is for the word cider. And it defines cider as this percent of alcohol.
Oh.
So it created the definition for what we would know as hard cider and named it cider.
Whoa.
And I got up, I said, this is a serious problem. I mean, if I'm a rushed mom in the store picking up cider for the kids, and
Right.
I'm not like reading the label carefully, or God forbid, I'm somebody who's been in recovery for a number
Right.
of years, and you think cider means it's not alcoholic, and we're calling it an alcoholic beverage. And
So this was a definition that said if it was above or below a certain amount, or like what was the?
It was an alcoholic beverage, an apple-based alcoholic
Oh, it
beverage.
didn't even put a percentage on it.
No,
because
it
there's
was alcohol.
like kombucha and stuff like that.
yeah, no,
you can
no.
have like 0.5% or something.
No, this was defining the alcoholic beverage
Okay,
that as cider.
Wow.
got it.
And,
That is
You're
You're right
problematic.
about moms. I would give cider to the kids just
Sure.
because it's healthy.
Yeah, yeah.
Whoa.
So I raised the issue, but I also realized, to try to amend it at that point.
Right.
And there was, you could see all of the heads on the floor. I
Right.
mean, there was pretty much immediate agreement. And in fact, the chair of the committee came over to me and said, yes, I'm so
Right.
glad you caught that. First thing next year, we will fix that. So I put the bill right in, so it'd be right up front. They've already
was
heard
that
it.
H1? One of them was
It
right.
wasn't
You had
H1,
one of the arrows.
but
Yeah.
it was it's
single
early
digit.
in the
Yeah,
month.
right.
And they've already heard about it. They've
Oh,
already
good.
said, "Oh yeah, one way or another, we're going to address it this year." So
Oh, you have a lot of angry moms. Oh,
Yeah, I
wow.
mean, I don't know that I don't know anyone was running out to change their labeling on
But I
their
bet they-
containers, but there is a risk to that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's right.
But
We
the
have,
cider people knew it was there.
yeah, I'm sure they did. Yeah.
Don't drink
But
anything this summer.
The only, I mean, what's interesting about that is the only company out there that I'm aware that's doing both like regular cider and hard cider is Cold Hollow. I think they're the only ones that I'm aware of
they
that's
do
doing
hard
both.
also.
Yeah, they have a whole tasting room now for hard
didn't
cider.
know that.
Yeah,
that.
it's separate from the cidery, like a different
Yeah,
building.
right.
Yep.
But
So just from I've never had hard cider, sorry. So does it taste like cider? Or you can tell it's hard
No,
cider?
you
can tell.
It's very different. I don't care for it. I like cider, and I love some of the other, like I'm hard lemonade,
Yeah,
things
right.
like that. But I don't like the hard cider. I
Oh,
don't know why.
it's sweet.
Yeah,
Maybe that's
because we have a thing to put on top of the fireplace, the wood burning stove to make the cider,
Yeah.
when I have company and stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's almost, you can almost think of it like, it's definitely its own thing, but it's sort of like beer in the fact that like it's heavy, right?
yeah, okay.
Right. But it's sweet. It's sweeter than beer typically would be. So
Because there's a lot in the stores,
yeah.
a lot of hard ciders these days.
you're not allowed to advertise alcohol on your show, probably. I mean, I'm just
I
a
don't
huge
know.
Mike's fan. That's
Oh,
why.
really? Oh,
That's
we
my
didn't know that.
go-to.
Yeah.
They
Lemonade,
had
black
some-
cherry.
Oh, I'm all into the craft beer. That's my
that's what
craft,
every
craft beer and whiskey, and that's where I am.
The first, when we worked together, almost every show, somehow, no matter who the guest was, we got around
We
to
got
craft
around
beer.
a couple of years there. We steered it back around to craft beer
Gotten
somehow.
Better,
So I really want to talk about that third bill.
Yeah,
because,
please go ahead,
because
the
this is
Medicare.
something that a lot of people are not aware of. It's off the radar, and that is what it really is the you might call it the birthday cliff for Medicare.
Right.
People think you hear Medicare for all. We all know Medicare's a great
Right,
program.
that's what
and all
they're
that.
pushing in the state.
But actually, Medicare is sort of like a baseline protection.
Yeah.
But
It's
you've gotta-
catastrophic insurance. Is
It's
really
catastrophic hospital insurance. You've got to pay for the physician part. It's
Right.
still a good deal.
Right.
But you got to pay. But then you're still not very protected unless you buy supplemental
right,
plans and
right.
so forth. But the problem is that, of course, Medicaid, in contrast, if you are very low level income,
Right.
Medicaid really is very comprehensive. It covers, everything.
Right.
Maybe some very low copays. But what we've done in terms of our supports for low-income folks, we have a different income threshold when you become eligible for Medicare, and your ability to get extra coverage drops. So just to pick easy round numbers, let's say that you're eligible for Medicaid if you're at 100% of poverty, which is very low when you hear
Right,
100%.
right.
It's very, very low.
It's a low number.
So you're eligible for Medicaid at 100%. Then you turn 65 and you're eligible for Medicare, and all of a sudden, in order to get any of the Medicaid level of benefits, you only get them up to 80% of
Right,
poverty.
right.
So if you're in that 80 to 100% of poverty, you turn 65 and you lose significant amounts of medical help.
Wow, great.
Of Medicaid,
Right when
or
you
you
right
become
need it the
disabled.
most.
Right when you need it the most, that's right.
Right.
So we're really leaving our poor elderly behind. They are losing coverage when they hit 65 and they're eligible for Medicare. They lose the level of medical support
So how did
for
they
their income.
how did they miss this? I mean, these are both federal programs, right? How has this gone on for so long and no one's like raised a flag and be like,
Well, the AAAs, the area agency, have brought it up. When I turned 65 and went for guidance and help, the person who was helping me said, "Oh, you're a state legislator. I need to tell you about this problem."
Wow.
This gap. She latched onto me right away. And it's just, we end up getting caught with other priorities. We miss some things. But our supports for those groups are very, very low. And
Right.
part of it is cost to bring them up to the same level as
Right.
what we support for people under age 65
Right.
would cost a lot of
Well,
money.
the risk factor is really high for over 65. You're going to get something.
That's right. That's right. And it's just an incredible injustice that
Yeah.
you turn 65 and we drop you from the level of support we gave you when you were 64, when you're just as poor.
Wow.
You're just as poor. You're barely scraping by, and all of a sudden we drop it.
So what does your bill do?
So the bill says we need to make it the same income levels as Medicaid. If you were eligible for Medicaid when you were 64, you should still be eligible for the supplement to Medicare that brings it equal to Medicaid
Right.
when you turn 65.
And who is going to yell at you for this?
Anybody
is
who
this the federal government? Or?
No, the federal government has no problem. Other states bring the
they
level
do?
higher.
Oh,
it will cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
this
from
is
the
part of
state?
the Affordable Care Act, right?
Right.
This is one of the options, the
No.
add-on options, or no?
No, because when you're on Medicare, when you turn, you're not eligible for anything under the Affordable Care Act. That
So
didn't
now-
address Medicare at all.
I
So
didn't-
the state
okay.
is looking, the VSEA is very angry about, the governor's looking to put us on Medicare plus Advantage.
A Medicare Advantage plan. And that's a whole other complicated section of Medicare. It is a big problem. The Advantage plans, for people who are not really wealthy enough to buy a supplemental plan,
right.
they are a terrific advantage. But they're not the same as having a supplemental plan.
Right.
I had to make my decisions. I chose an Advantage plan because it protects me from, it's like catastrophic coverage.
Right.
Because, with Medicare, you called it catastrophic, you can still owe hundreds of thousands. There's
Right.
no cap.
There's no cap.
There's no cap. With an Advantage plan, at least you have a cap at like $6,000. So, but you could have a lot of costs
Right.
if you have a lot of medical expenses. With a supplemental plan, you're completely protected.
Because right now I get supplemental through the state.
That's right.
And Bruce was sick, I've mentioned it before, for 9 weeks this last summer.
Yeah.
We had there was hardly any bills.
That's right, because with the
coverage was
supplemental,
fabulous.
they're terrific,
Yeah.
but they do cost a lot of money. Now, what the governor is saying is that the Advantage plan that they've negotiated would give fully equivalent coverage. That's the argument, and I think a lot of the legislators, myself included, are saying, well, if it's that good a deal, then sell the folks on it.
Right.
And if you can't, don't come to us, because the law says they have to get the same thing as the state
Right.
employees negotiate for. So
Our concern is
convince
right
them.
now, he's negotiating, but he's got something to negotiate with. He's got all these people. When they have us and they go to negotiate again, what's the leverage? They
Yeah,
could just throw us out the window.
The legislators are probably like, don't put us in the middle of your collective bargaining
Right,
process.
that's why the
right?
union's very
That's right.
upset, because maybe
They're-
the first 2 years, if that's the bargaining time, you may get a good deal, but after that,
Well, and then, and a lot of folks who are making that choice when they're turning 65, miss the fact, don't realize you can't go back to a supplemental plan
No, you got to pay.
without paying a huge surcharge.
oh,
So the kind of guaranteed issue, as it's called, the lower cost,
Right.
the supplemental plans as they cost today.
Yeah.
If you don't buy into them within the first year after you turn 65, you can still buy one in Vermont, but they will
bucks.
cost much more.
Wow.
You're not part of that guaranteed
Yeah.
group. So it really is a decision with a lot of repercussions.
and I love all those supplemental A, B, C, and it's always by a certified insurance or registered. It's not the government, it's then everybody
Oh, no, it's
thinks it is.
underwritten. It's
Yeah,
underwritten.
exactly.
Yeah.
Who knows who you're dealing with?
Yeah, and they'll go out and get an underwriter, and I don't think there's anything in the contract about who the underwriter can be. I doubt
Yeah,
it.
no, because I like it in the contract, it says equal,
Yeah.
so.
Well,
Not
and
equal for 2 years, equal.
Right, equal, that's right, equal.
Yeah.
And I don't trust them after 2 years, because you won't have any leverage.
That's right.
Right now, they want all of us, but man, I hope the legislature sees that. I know it costs
Well, I
a lot
don't-
of money, but
I think the legislature is looking and saying, hey, you have to follow the law. I don't
Right.
think the legislature is going to allow a change in the law that would permit it. And
the
I
only,
think-
the only
yeah.
way, as we've talked about here, is to deal with the new hires. Do something dramatic with new state employees, because they're going to take the job based on this.
Then
And
bargain
leave it-
on that. You don't
yeah.
change a deal, right?
Right,
You don't
exactly.
change a
Thank
deal
you,
after
Ann.
it's been made. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Good, let's make
For
this
retirement
video.
benefits also.
Well,
Right,
It's just, there's no
exactly.
contract that we sign, but you leave at a certain age knowing this is what you've got, and you've made your decision based on how much you have in pension, how much you have in medical, but if we knew some of this other stuff, maybe we'd still be working.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course I am, but that's
Well, I was going to
beside
say,
the point.
well, maybe you're not a great example.
I'm still working. Let's find somebody else. But anyway, it's an unwritten contract, or you just don't pull the rug out like that.
Right.
So I'm not for it. So there you go. Am I supposed to say that on the show? No. I'm
Probably not.
neutral.
You're supposed to say,
Well, you're talking to your legislature.
Yes, I am, and this is about me.
well,
There
good
you
thing
go.
you both agree.
We always agree.
Something we should talk about.
We do, don't we, Ann? Yeah.
Something we should talk about. We touched on it earlier, but mental health and the situation that we're in now. We talked a little bit about some of the changes that have happened in the last 30 years. This is an issue that's also front burner for me. I have a family member with a severe mental illness. What are the hurdles that we have right now? There's a bill that was introduced this year that is being debated about protections for healthcare workers and what
Right.
that looks like, because
Right.
oftentimes people with severe mental illnesses end up in a hospital
Right.
setting, and oftentimes end up acting out and injuring
Right.
healthcare workers. What
So
what
let's
is the
not
path forward?
mix issues.
Right. Okay. Multiple issues there.
Multiple issues there, and because we have become clearly a more violent society,
Yeah.
progressively.
Clearly happening. Yeah.
Clearly happening. People's tolerance levels,
Right.
and a lot of that has nothing to do with mental illness.
Right.
So
It's anger.
it's anger, and the emergency rooms are seeing people coming in who are angry, who don't want to wait, who are, there is violence. Are some of those folks people with a mental illness? Absolutely, but this is a much broader problem, and so those can't and shouldn't be connected, and in fact, well, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I think a lot of the roots of the problems in meeting the needs for mental health really go way back to the fact that we, for so long, didn't consider it part of health care
Right.
and segregated it and continue to segregate it and discriminate against it. So, we wouldn't think of putting the kind of limits on access to health care as we do on mental health. And I can give you an immediate example. You've probably heard about the proposal to create a children's inpatient psychiatric
Yeah.
unit down in
Right.
Bennington,
Right.
which there's $9 million in the Governor's Budget Adjustment Act to fund that construction. So I want to ask you, when's the last time you saw something in the state budget to expand, let's say, a cardiology unit at one of the hospitals?
Right. That'd be never.
Never.
Right.
The healthcare system, the revenues from patient fees pay for hospital construction.
Right.
And they may say, they're in precarious financial situations, but they still do it. UVMMC just announced applying for CON to go forward with a new surgery center. They're in financial,
Right.
they're not in great shape, but they are still doing that. Why in the world would the state
Right.
be paying for a psychiatric inpatient unit? And the answer is because our financing system still does not treat mental health equally.
Right.
Psychiatric units lose money. Surgery makes money. That's not the way to run a healthcare system
right.
where there's that kind of disparity. And yet that's still true. So we have community mental health centers, which came into being because of the segregation of the system.
Right.
We created community mental health systems with federal and state money because our health insurance didn't cover mental health. So they were they're a remnant, still very alive remnant of our separation. So until we really integrate and recognize that we have health care and we have different
Right.
components, and we have cardiac and we have psychiatric
Right.
and we have orthopedic, look at my bum ankle, and then we'll begin to see, first of all, the connections, because if you talk to any primary care doctor, the numbers are something like 60 or 70% of primary care events are rooted in mental health
Right.
issues.
Yeah.
Now, I thought you told me that they have they did combine it, and it's getting better, but obviously
We are
only a little better.
We are making progress
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. I think we're making progress in public understanding. We've made a lot of progress over the past with parity in insurance,
Right.
requiring it, and then finally the federal law requiring it of the insurers that are
Right.
controlled under
Right.
state law. But in terms of actual services, when you look at the challenges of our community mental health agencies, their inability to fund positions at the level that those positions would be funded when they're working in
Right.
other areas.
Right.
When you look at the fact that we can't get the inpatient capacity we need. We don't have an urgent care system for mental health. We have urgent care
Right.
for everything
Yeah.
else, and we
Right.
wonder why people go to the emergency room.
Right.
There isn't an urgent care capacity.
and we
if you
actually-
try to get community services, you're put on a waiting list that
Yep.
could be
Yeah.
months long.
So if you have an acute problem, like that these people end up in ERs.
That's right.
Which are usually not set up and designed in a way to handle. They're designed for acute physical problems,
Right.
not acute mental
And
problems.
that's part of the problem too, because they should be able to have the capacity for acute mental health problems as well, because that's a part of healthcare. But it should be addressing them and accommodating them in the same amount of time, like 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, depending on what has to be assessed
Yeah.
and tested, not days and days.
Triage and manage the crisis.
And
That's
that's
what an emergency room is
In our
for.
hospital here, our police are at the emergency room, and they're the ones that wind up dealing with the mentally ill, because if they come in, a lot of times they're sort of subdued or whatever, and as they're coming out, that was a big issue and discussion in Berlin, was what our law enforcement officers had to deal with without training.
This was some time ago, I
A
guess?
couple of years ago,
Yeah,
and
because unfortunately now, because they didn't have the resources to redo the emergency room, I mean, the result is a very negative environment
right,
now.
right.
If you go in there asking for help for a mental health crisis, you could end up being put in, what's essentially a jail cell in the
Right,
emergency
right,
room.
exactly.
Which is also not appropriate care,
Right.
but they're backed against
Yeah.
a wall in a way
Well, because
as
they have no training. I mean, they're police, and they're meant to
Oh,
respond.
I'm talking about the emergency room staff.
The emergency
Oh, the
room
emergency
staff.
room staff, oh, yeah, well,
Yeah,
that's
no,
another whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was a big issue in Berlin, because the police are like, hello, this isn't what we can do, because they
Right.
don't have, and the same when Tony Fakos was the chief of police here in Montpelier, they'd go out on calls, and they don't have the training to deal with mentally ill folks in their home and having struggles, and
And I think we're making a lot of progress on that. There has been a lot of
yeah,
investment
social
in.
workers going with them.
That's right,
Yeah.
and embedded with the state police. Also a lot more focus, just even this year, on increasing our crisis response capacity for mental health.
Yeah.
Because we hear a lot about our agencies having crisis teams, crisis response teams, but most of those teams are limited to really just screening people at the hospital in the emergency room. They're not actually mobile. They can't go to a location, go to somebody's home and stabilize things
Right.
on an urgent.
And this is one of the things actually is interesting with the reforms the Burlington Police Department's been doing. They have those people on staff. They're officers,
Yep.
but they're
They're
specifically
trained,
trained for
Great.
mental health crisis response.
There are a lot of good models for doing it. I think one of the things that some are doing, and is probably not enough, is really working with a lot of peer support staff,
Right.
which is a really effective model.
Yep.
People, like myself, other people who have been through it, who can make that connection and say, I've been there too.
Right.
We can work this out. We can, that can be a big help.
That's great. So I don't mean, we only have about 9 minutes, and I did want to touch on the other things that you're involved in, like you have nothing else to do. You're on the task force on affordable access healthcare, or is that an older committee? Is that still functioning?
That is not. That was a summer study
Oh, okay.
committee
All
working
right.
on proposals.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you are on House Rules?
I am on the House Rules
Oh,
Committee.
that's a toughie.
Well, it's been particularly interested with all of the COVID issues.
I bet.
Because we were the ones who had to set all of the rules on,
Right.
how are we going to function remotely?
Right.
How are we going to come back safely? All of
And
those
that came
things.
through the Rules Committee.
Oh, yeah.
That all came through the Rules Committee, yeah.
And just for your information, whenever a bill is passed, most of them have to go to the Rules Committee to find out how to implement. And that's sort of the...
You're thinking of the Administrative Rules Committee.
Oh, what is this House Rules Committee?
This is House Rules, which is the functioning of the House.
Oh, well,
Like, can we allow people to vote from home because of the COVID crisis?
Oh, that's very interesting, because I
Gotta
was
pass
thinking
rules.
about the
You're
other
thinking of the
committee,
Administrative
'cause
Rules
that's
Committee, right?
a nightmare.
Yes.
Yeah, no, the House Rules Committee is interesting because it doesn't meet that often, normally.
Normally. It's been
Normally.
meeting a lot.
It's been meeting a lot the last couple of years, but normally
Interesting.
it meets occasionally, and it's usually leadership from both parties. But it's literally like, what are the rules for decorum on the House floor and like things like that.
Oh,
I'll tell
so
you,
there
they were
you
a
go.
lot
I
of
should
fun.
know that.
I was the reporter on the floor of when we decided to, because you have antiquated language, and if the rule of the House floor is that gentlemen shall wear jackets and
Oh,
ties,
yes.
and women shall wear dresses, it's like, maybe we need to update
Maybe
that.
we need to do a little house cleaning.
Yes,
You know,
yes. And so we did, and we changed it to the requirement that all members shall wear what's called business professional,
right.
which is a level of,
Yeah.
so business
My-
professional.
my first
but
day-
what was fascinating is that we went and looked at what other states do, and they're all over the map. Some of them
Right.
are pretty wild.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, my first day on the House floor, somebody said to me, because a woman has to make or at the time, the woman had...
It was just tradition,
I
yes.
thought he was putting me on. I said, do I look stupid to you? I'm not doing that. And he goes, no, it's really the rule. You have to stand up and ask permission for the men to take off their jackets. And it's got to be a woman that this was back...
This is in May, when it gets to be May, it gets to be very warm.
Right.
Right.
And everybody's
And there has
sweating.
to be a motion to
Yeah.
allow it. And so by tradition, I
It's the woman.
don't think it was a rule, but by tradition, a woman would be the one who would get up
Well-
and ask to suspend the rules to allow the gentlemen to remove their jackets.
I
Yeah,
thought they
because
were-
it's like 90 degrees
Yeah,
in the
right,
House
and they're
chamber, and they're
sweating,
like
and they're
pouring sweat.
And I thought they were pulling my chain, so I didn't do it, and they were so... I said,
So-
how do I know that?
But I'll tell you, when I was reporting on this and we had looked at other states, we discovered Hawaii has, every Friday is
Dressed down
aloha
days.
attire.
So we'll come
permitted.
in flip-flops?
Well, so one day last session, we had a day, the heat was malfunctioning.
Oh, wonderful.
So it wasn't just chilly on the House floor, it was cold, and
Right.
people were putting on their jackets.
Right.
And so at the end, I got up and said, Madam Speaker, if you recall when I introduced our new rule, I omitted to say that on Fridays we would have ski day, ski attire day.
Ski attire,
nice.
yes.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, no,
like it.
I thought they were pulling my leg, so I didn't do it.
Well, it's great, and it's
They
a great
were
way
pretty
to
upset.
it's a great way to save on heating costs too for
right,
the state
exactly.
house.
And then watch the bats flying overhead. That's another story.
That comes out
Yeah.
in May too, the
Yeah,
bat
right,
wave.
the
bats,
There's
yeah.
a lot
And
of
we
Because
need
they're
to
all up
save
in
on
the-
heating, because when we start paying the heating bills after our unaffordable heat bill passes.
Oh,
this
man.
year.
Oh, they can't, that...
Though we could spend a whole nother. Well, let's spend a couple shows talking about that.
Yeah, we've got to get Matt Coda on here.
Yeah.
Well, when Pat shared with me the list of questions she was going to ask, I looked at it, and so I wrote back to her and I said, "So it's a 3-hour show."
well,
is that-
Yeah, it's a 3-hour. She writes questions like it's a
I
3-hour
do.
show.
I do.
All I'll say on the clean heat bill, I have my house in Burlington has electric baseboard heating because it was built in the 70s.
Yeah.
Electric baseboard heating was original heating source. It was retrofitted in the 90s with a natural gas furnace for good reason,
Right.
because the electric baseboard heaters are very expensive
Right.
to run.
We bought our house, it was almost, I don't remember how long ago it was, all electric. Within a week, Bruce had them yanked out, and we put our system
left-
2000 in.
We left the electric baseboards in
Oh,
because
did
it's
you?
easy enough to just leave them there, and then
Yeah.
you have a backup heating
Yeah,
source.
exactly,
Right,
Then you have a backup, but we don't turn them on because it's very expensive. to
Well,
run.
I
Exactly,
voted
it's
for
ridiculous.
the clean heat bill last year. I was the only Republican who voted for it on the House floor. because the Senate had changed it and had said it's got to come, they've got to come back to the legislature to get a sign off
they have
on
to do
any
a check
plan.
back.
And then I was okay, yes, do the research,
right.
come
They're not
back.
going to pass that this year.
But
No,
but
they
if it,
can't.
but if it comes back again like it was in the House last year, and it's just, you know, go and do it and tell us what it's going to cost afterwards, no, that's irresponsible.
That is irresponsible, and I would say, well, I would say I'm all about reducing our carbon footprint, but this bill doesn't really even do that, to be honest, because it really matters a lot about where the energy is coming from, right? We have no idea where the energy is coming from, and if we do this, we flip the switch today to move all to electric heat, that energy is coming from a natural gas plant in Connecticut, and that's not any better than burning it here. In fact, it's worse than burning it here.
So we have 2-3 minutes left, and what other issues are before your committee that our listeners, viewers, would be interested in?
Getting too comfortable with radio.
I know.
Right now, we're we're looking at the Department of Children and Families planning around new facilities, replacing the fact that we closed Woodside.
Yeah.
And it's an intriguing perspective for me because I'm looking and I'm saying, my gosh, this is exactly the same thing as what we've done with mental health. We don't spend enough on the lower ends of care, foster home, paying enough to foster families, building those systems. So we end up with having these higher end needs, whether it's a lockup, building a new lockup, or going to hospitalization. And so we end up putting the money there, and all of a sudden that becomes the priority because we've got people who need that highest end of care, like we do with kids now, and that sucks up all the money.
And that sucks. And you're not doing preventative care. You're not doing primary care.
And
what is this for children?
This is for children, for delinquency. Building a new, a short-term lockup for stabilization and until they can place them, and then, at least one other locked treatment facility that might be 4 or 5 months. And so, it's, I think we need to be really careful and thoughtful and make sure that we're not overbuilding for that particular need. There's certainly times when it's needed, and we need to have it. Right now, it's not tenable. We have nothing at all. So we got situations where you have a couple of social work staff who have to stay with a child for, days, in the lobby of a police department somewhere, or something like that. It's
not too messed
It's
up.
amazing to me, like, you look at our, I'll keep referring to it as our mental health system. It's part of our healthcare system, but it's a specific specialty, right? And no one would design the system we have, right? Nobody would design the system we have.
No one would design the system of financing healthcare that we have. That was an accident of history.
That is an accident of history,
and
too. Yeah. So, but
how do you unwind it?
how do you unwind it, right? And this is the thing that policymakers have struggled with for years, right?
Seems to me there's a couple of other areas like education and a few other things that we
There's
could
so many
talk
things
about.
that we know. If $1 worth of prevention saves $8 down the line or $10 down the line, right? But if you're already having to spend that $10,
You can't go back.
You don't have the spare dollar to put in prevention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you that. It's probably too late. We're too far down the road with this, with the child.
Well, and then you have heartbreaking stories on the $10 end of the
Yes.
right. No, you don't get the heartbreaking stories on the prevention end, right? Until it's too late.
So we do have to close up the show. Thank you very much. As always, you are very informative, and thank you for all the work you do.
Well, thank you,
Seriously.
and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
Enjoy
Ben.
talking.
Of course.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont. And don't forget, listening beyond the sound bites.